When we talk about global hotspots, the DRC doesn't always come to mind, but right now it's a situation you really need to understand, especially with the M23 rebels and all the accusations against Rwanda.
Yeah,
And we've got this BBC article, Outgunning Congo, that digs into the evidence, and I gotta say, some of it is pretty startling.
absolutely.
So, are you ready to unpack this together?
Yeah, this is really this is a powder keg
Yeah.
that could ignite the whole region. And to grasp what's going on, we need to consider the history, the players, and the potential fallout.
Okay, so let's start with the on-the-ground reality.
Okay.
Paint me a picture of Goma.
Okay.
What's it like there right now?
So imagine a city perched on the edge of a volcano, literally and figuratively, right?
Right.
Goma is this bustling trading hub in eastern DRC, right on the Rwandan border, and it's also a key base for the UN peacekeeping mission. But right now, it's a city under siege.
Yeah.
The M23 rebels have essentially seized control. The population has ballooned to 2 million, with refugees pouring in and basic services have crumbled.
The article mentions Congolese soldiers actually surrendering to Rwanda.
Yeah,
That's a pretty striking image.
it is.
What does that tell us about the situation?
Well, it's a stark illustration of the power dynamics at play, right?
Yeah.
Imagine choosing to surrender to another country rather than continue fighting your own war. It speaks to the fear and desperation these soldiers must feel, and it really raises serious questions about the Congolese army's capacity to effectively counter the M23.
And what about the UN? They've got a massive peacekeeping force there.
Yeah.
What's their assessment of Rwanda's involvement?
Well, the UN peacekeeping chief Jean-Pierre Lacroix has gone on record stating that Rwandan troops are undeniably operating in Goma, providing support to the M23. And while the exact numbers are unclear, their presence alone is a major red flag.
Wow.
It directly contradicts Rwanda's official denials and adds a whole other layer of complexity to this conflict.
Speaking of the Niles, Rwanda's been pretty vocal about rejecting any accusations.
Right.
But the article hints at a shift in their narrative.
Right.
What's that all about?
It's a subtle dance, really.
Okay.
Initially, they were adamant in their denials, but now, as the evidence mounts, they've transitioned to a more nuanced approach, claiming they're simply taking defensive measures. It's a way to acknowledge their presence without admitting to any wrongdoing.
So they're basically saying, yeah, we're there, but we're not the aggressors.
Precisely, their foreign ministry released a statement expressing concern over misguided or manipulative accusations and emphasizing the threat this conflict poses to their own security. It's a classic tactic of deflecting blame while justifying their actions.
This all feels very intertwined with Rwanda's history, specifically the 1994 genocide.
Of course.
Could you unpack that connection for us?
Well, you can't understand Rwanda's actions in the DRC without acknowledging the deep trauma of the genocide.
Right.
For President Kagame, who led the Tutsi forces that ended the genocide, it's a defining event. It's shaped their national psyche. And there's this lingering fear of the FDLR, a Hutu rebel group active in eastern DRC.
Okay, so for Kagame, this isn't just about geopolitics.
No,
It's
absolutely. The FDLR includes individuals who were directly involved in the genocide. He sees them as an existential threat, a genocidal militia that must be neutralized. And this justifies his interventions in the DRC as a matter of national security.
right.
It's a powerful narrative, but it's also one that some use to excuse Rwandan interference in Congolese affairs.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the M23 rebels themselves.
Okay,
Who are they and what do they want?
so the M23, which stands for the March 23 movement, has a convoluted history.
Okay.
They emerged in 2012, claiming to champion the rights of the Tutsi minority in eastern DRC. There was a peace deal they supposedly disarmed, but then they reemerged a few years ago, claiming the deal was broken.
So on the surface, they're fighting for Tutsi rights, but the article suggests there might be more to their agenda, right?
But you're catching on.
Okay.
Their actions indicate broader goals, especially controlling those lucrative coltan mines.
Right.
Coltan, by the way, is a key ingredient in your phone, your laptop, basically all your electronics. So suddenly, those mines in the DRC are connected to our everyday lives.
Yeah.
And the M23 have proven to be highly organized and well-trained, with an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 fighters.
And they're using child soldiers,
Yes.
which is just horrific.
The UN has documented cases of forced recruitment, including children. Local chiefs have been pressured to provide recruits, some voluntarily, some not. And while Rwanda vehemently denies these accusations, the evidence from the UN paints a pretty grim picture.
So we've got this complex historical context, the M23 with their own agenda and Rwanda potentially pulling the strings.
Yeah.
But what's the hard evidence linking Rwanda to all of this?
Well, the UN experts have assembled a damning body of evidence. Photos, drone-footage videos, eyewitness accounts, and intelligence reports, for example. They've documented Rwandan officers overseeing training at the M23's main base in Chanzu, a mountainous area near the Rwandan border.
So we're talking about more than just a few rogue soldiers crossing the border.
Oh, yeah.
It seems pretty systematic.
It's exactly. They even have details on M23 graduation ceremonies for new recruits, with thousands graduating between September and October of last year. And some of those ceremonies were attended by Sultani Makenga, the M23's top military commander.
Wow, that's pretty hard to dismiss as coincidence.
Right.
And what about those captured M23 fighters? The article mentions something about them referring to Rwandan troops as the friendly force.
Yes, that's a key detail. These fighters, even when speaking other languages, use that specific term, friendly force, to refer to Rwandan troops. It points to a level of coordination and collaboration that's hard to deny.
And just how many Rwandan troops are we talking about here?
Well, the UN estimates there are 3,000 to 4,000 Rwandan soldiers operating within the DRC, providing direct support to the M23. It's a significant force contradicting Rwanda's claims of limited involvement.
It's starting to sound less like defensive measures and more like a full-blown proxy war.
Yeah.
And the article mentions Uganda's involved too.
Right.
How do they fit into all of this?
So Uganda is a close ally of Rwanda, and there are accusations of their involvement as well. Reports indicate they are supplying weapons to the M23, hosting some of their leaders and allowing their fighters to move across their borders naturally. Uganda denies these allegations, but it adds another layer of complexity to an already tangled web.
So we've got Rwanda potentially driven by historical grievances, the M23 vying for power and resources, and Uganda possibly fanning the flames.
Yes.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
What stands out to you as particularly significant?
Well, for me, the evidence of Rwanda's direct involvement, particularly the sophisticated weaponry being used by the M23, is the most compelling.
Right.
We're not talking about your average ragtag rebel group here.
Yeah.
These guys have access to advanced weapons and technology that's clearly beyond the capabilities of other armed groups in the region.
Okay, let's dive into those weapons. What kind of firepower are we talking about?
The heavy artillery, like those 122-millimeter rockets used to attack displacement camps.
Oh, God.
It's a terrifying thought.
It's just horrifying to imagine families fleeing their homes only to be targeted in camps where they should be safe.
Absolutely. And then there's the evidence of Israeli-made anti-tank guided missiles. These are weapons not typically found in the arsenals of local militias, and they're using technology to jam GPS signals, effectively grounding the Congolese army's Chinese-acquired drones. This level of technological warfare is a game changer in the region.
So Rwanda's deeply involved. The M23 has advanced weaponry, and Uganda might be adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
But what's the end game here? What's motivating Rwanda to invest so heavily in the M23?
It's a multi-layered question. On one hand, there's the historical context and the perceived threat from the FDLR, but there's also a powerful economic incentive at play.
You're talking about those coltan mines, right?
Exactly. Control of those mines is a huge factor. Remember, coltan is a critical mineral for electronics, and those mines in the DRC are some of the richest in the world. The M23 captured Rubaya, a key mining town, back in May. The UN estimates they're pulling in at least $800,000 a month from taxing coltan in Rubaya alone, and they're shipping about 120 tons of the mineral to Rwanda every 4 weeks.
So there's a clear financial incentive for Rwanda to back the M23 and secure control of these valuable resources.
Absolutely. And satellite imagery reveals a newly widened road leading from Rubaya to the Rwandan border, further supporting the evidence of coltan being transported across the border.
It's adding up to a pretty damning case against Rwanda.
Yeah.
Has the international community tried to intervene at all?
Well, the East African community led by Kenya is attempting to mediate, but it's been a bumpy road. Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi is understandably reluctant to engage in talks, especially with President Kagame.
Yeah, with all this evidence of Rwandan involvement, I can see why he'd be hesitant.
Yeah, and Kagame seems fixated on the FDLR, framing them as the root cause of the instability. He's expressed frustration with President Tshisekedi's refusal to cooperate in addressing the FDLR, which could be another factor driving Rwanda's support for the M23. It's almost like they're saying, if you won't help us deal with the FDLR, we'll find it another way.
We've covered a lot of ground here, but it feels like we've only scratched the surface of this tangled web.
Yeah, it's a complex situation, and we've only just begun to explore its depths. But before we move on, I want to pause and pose a question for you. Given this historical context, the evidence we've discussed, and the tangled regional dynamics, where do you think this conflict is heading? What are the potential scenarios that could play out, and what might the consequences be for the DRC and the region as a whole?
Those are some big questions, and ones we'll definitely delve into further as our deep dive continues. We've been digging into this conflict in the DRC, peeling back all the layers of, history, politics, and economics.
Yeah.
But at the heart of it all, there are people caught in the crossfire. It's easy to get lost in all the geopolitical maneuvering, but we can't forget the human cost of this conflict.
Right. It's a heartbreaking reality. The violence has uprooted hundreds of thousands of people, forcing them to flee their homes, leaving behind everything they know. They end up crammed into overcrowded camps, often lacking even the most basic necessities.
It's a desperate situation. We talked about those 122 millimeter rockets being fired at displacement camps. It's hard to fathom the terror these families must experience. Can you tell us more about what it's like for civilians caught in the middle of this conflict?
Imagine living with the constant threat of violence, never knowing when the next attack might come. These camps, meant to offer refuge, become targets.
Right.
They lack proper sanitation, clean water, adequate food. Disease spreads rapidly, adding another layer of suffering to an already desperate situation.
And we talked about the use of child soldiers and another horrific aspect of this conflict. What happens to these children who are forced into fighting?
Well, it's a tragedy on so many levels. These children, often abducted from their families, are robbed of their childhoods, forced to endure brutal training, and exposed to unimaginable horrors. The psychological scars they carry can last a lifetime, and the cycle of violence just becomes so deeply entrenched. It's a stain on humanity, really.
It's a vicious cycle indeed, and it's not just those directly involved in the fighting who are affected.
Right.
What are the broader implications for the region as a whole?
Well, the entire eastern region of the DRC is deeply destabilized, and that instability has a ripple effect. The influx of refugees strains resources in neighboring countries, trade routes are disrupted, economies are crippled, and development is stunted. Yeah. It's a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions.
So this conflict has the potential to unravel the entire region. We've discussed the evidence pointing to Rwandan involvement and their potential economic motives.
Right.
But what are the possible scenarios for how this might all play out? What are the potential outcomes here?
It's difficult to predict with certainty, but let's explore some possibilities. One scenario is that the M23, with continued backing from Rwanda, continues to gain territory, further destabilizing the region and potentially even posing a threat to the Congolese government itself.
So a full-blown takeover by the M23 is a possibility.
It's not outside the realm of possibility, but it's important to remember the Congolese army, while facing challenges, is still a force to be reckoned with. And international intervention, though complex and often fraught with difficulties, is another factor that could shift the balance of power.
What about a negotiated settlement? Is there any hope for a peaceful resolution to this conflict?
A negotiated settlement is certainly the most desirable outcome, but it faces immense hurdles. There's deep mistrust between the parties involved, and the weight of history makes finding common ground incredibly challenging.
We discussed President Kagame's focus on the FDLR.
Yeah.
How does that factor into potential negotiations?
It's a major sticking point. Kagame has repeatedly stated that addressing the FDLR threat is a non-negotiable precondition for any talks with President Tshisekedi. This creates a significant impasse, as it raises questions about Congolese sovereignty and the legitimacy of Rwandan demands.
So even if negotiations were to take place, there's no guarantee of success.
Right?
And President Tshisekedi has been reluctant to engage with Kagame, so what options does he have at this point?
He's in a difficult position. He could continue to fight, attempting to repel the M23 with support from the UN or other regional forces. But as we've seen, relying on external forces comes with its own set of complexities and limitations. UN peacekeeping missions often face logistical and political constraints, and regional interventions can sometimes exacerbate existing tensions.
What about appealing to the international community for more support? Could sanctions against Rwanda be a possibility?
Sanctions are a tool that can be used to exert pressure, but their effectiveness is often debated. There's always the risk of unintended consequences, particularly for ordinary citizens. And Rwanda has powerful allies who might resist or undermine such measures. It's a delicate balancing act, weighing the potential impact and unintended consequences of any action.
So President Tshisekedi is facing a series of difficult choices, each with its own risks and potential rewards.
Yeah.
What about the international community? What role can they play in helping to resolve this conflict?
Well, the international community has a responsibility to act, both in providing humanitarian assistance and in supporting efforts to find a political solution. They can use their diplomatic leverage to encourage dialogue, provide mediation support, and perhaps even consider targeted sanctions if necessary. But they also need to ensure any intervention is carefully considered, taking into account the complexities of the situation and the potential for unintended consequences.
It sounds like a multi-pronged approach is needed, addressing both the immediate humanitarian crisis and the underlying political and economic drivers of the conflict.
Absolutely.
But what about us, the everyday listeners?
Yeah.
We might feel helpless in the face of such a complex and distant conflict. Can we as individuals make a difference?
Absolutely. We may not be policymakers or diplomats, but our voices and actions still matter. Staying informed is crucial. The more we understand the complexities of this conflict, the better equipped we are to advocate for meaningful solutions. Supporting organizations providing humanitarian aid is another tangible way to make a difference.
So educating ourselves, raising awareness, and supporting those on the ground are all important contributions.
Exactly. And never underestimate the power of speaking out against injustice and holding our leaders accountable for their actions.
It's a reminder that even in the face of seemingly intractable global conflicts, our individual actions and voices can contribute to positive change.
We've discussed the complexities of the conflict, explored potential scenarios, and considered the roles of various actors.
Right.
But the story doesn't end here. There are long-term consequences to consider, ramifications that extend far beyond the immediate violence.
And that's where we'll pick up in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll examine the potential long-term impact of this conflict on the DRC, the region, and perhaps even the world. We've gone deep into the heart of this conflict in the DRC, uncovering the historical roots, the tangled web of alliances, and the devastating human cost.
Right.
But as with any crisis, the ripples, extend far beyond the immediate impact.
Yeah.
So let's shift our focus a little bit and explore the potential long-term consequences of this conflict?
Yeah, this isn't just about who controls territory today. It's about the potential to reshape the entire region for years to come.
Right.
We're talking about the stability of nations, the security of borders, the economic prospects of millions. The stakes are incredibly high.
One of the most alarming possibilities is this conflict spilling over into neighboring countries. We've already seen hints of Uganda's involvement. Could this escalate into a wider regional war?
It's a very real concern.
Yeah.
Think of it like a brush fire, already burning out of control with embers drifting towards this tinderbox of, existing tensions.
Right.
The region is already grappling with multiple armed groups, political instability, competition for resources. An escalation in the DRC could easily ignite those flashpoints, drawing in more actors and creating a conflagration that's far harder to contain.
And as we've discussed, the humanitarian crisis is already dire. What would a wider conflict mean for the people caught in the crossfire?
A regional war would be a humanitarian catastrophe of unimaginable scale.
Yeah.
We're already seeing massive displacement, and that would multiply exponentially. Imagine the strain on resources, the spread of disease, the breakdown of social structures. It's a terrifying prospect.
It's heartbreaking to think about. We've talked about the economic importance of those coltan mines.
Yeah.
But the conflict is disrupting so much more than just mining. What are the long-term economic consequences for the region?
Imagine a virus attacking the economic nervous system of a region. That's what this conflict is doing. It's not just about the lost revenue from mining. It's about trade routes being severed, businesses being shuttered, investments drying up. This kind of disruption has long-lasting effects on development, pushing entire communities further into poverty and making recovery that much harder.
It's a tragic cycle. Conflict, breeding poverty, and poverty are often fueling further conflict. Breaking that cycle seems almost impossible in a situation like this.
It requires a monumental, sustained effort.
Yeah.
We're talking about addressing the root causes of the conflict, fostering economic opportunities, promoting good governance, strengthening institutions. It's a massive undertaking. But ultimately, it all hinges on achieving a lasting peace. Without that, progress in any other area will be limited at best.
And that brings us back to the question of a political solution. Is there any realistic hope for a negotiated settlement, something that addresses the deep-seated grievances and paves the way for a sustainable peace?
Hope should never be abandoned, but we need to be realistic about the challenges. Achieving peace will require immense courage, skillful diplomacy, and a willingness from all parties to make difficult compromises.
And President Kagame's fixation on the FDLR seems to be a major roadblock. Is there any way around that?
That's the million-dollar question. His insistence on dealing with the FDLR as a precondition for any talks with President Tshisekedi creates a real impasse.
Yeah.
It raises questions about Congolese sovereignty, and it fuels suspicion that Rwanda might be using the FDLR as a pretext for interfering in Congolese affairs. Finding a way to address Kagame's legitimate security concerns while respecting the DRC's sovereignty is essential, but it's a delicate and potentially explosive balancing act.
So it sounds like navigating those diplomatic waters will require some incredibly skilled negotiators.
Absolutely.
But what about the role of the international community? They've been involved in peacekeeping and mediation efforts, but is that enough?
The international community has a responsibility to step up, not just with words, but with concrete actions. They can leverage their diplomatic influence to bring the parties to the negotiating table, provide mediation support, and ensure that any peace agreement is robust and implementable. They can also provide much-needed humanitarian assistance to alleviate the suffering of those caught in the crossfire.
So you've mentioned accountability before.
Right.
How can the international community hold those fueling the conflict responsible for their actions?
Accountability is crucial without consequences for those who perpetuate violence and instability. There's no real incentive for them to change their behavior. Targeted sanctions against individuals or entities supporting the M23, particularly within the Rwandan government or military, could be a powerful tool. It sends a clear message that the international community is watching and that there will be repercussions for actions that undermine peace and stability.
So we're talking about a combination of diplomatic pressure, humanitarian aid, and potentially targeted sanctions to address the crisis and hold those responsible accountable. But what about the role of everyday citizens like us? It can feel overwhelming to think about making a difference in such a complex and distant conflict.
I understand that feeling, but it's important to remember that our actions, however small they may seem, can contribute to positive change. Staying informed is the first step. The more we understand about these complex issues, the better equipped we are to have informed conversations, advocate for change, and hold our leaders accountable.
So educating ourselves is crucial. What else can we do?
Supporting organizations providing humanitarian aid to those affected by the conflict is another tangible way to make a difference. These organizations are working tirelessly to provide food, shelter, medical care, and other essential services to those in desperate need.
It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming global challenges, we can choose to be agents of change.
Exactly. By staying informed, raising awareness, supporting those working on the ground, and holding our leaders accountable, we can contribute to a more peaceful and just world.
This deep dive into the conflict in the DRC has been both enlightening and sobering. We've explored the complex historical roots, the tangled web of alliances, the devastating human cost, and the potential for long-lasting consequences.
Yeah, it's a story that underscores the fragility of peace, the interconnectedness of our world, and the importance of informed and engaged citizenship.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you leave with a deeper understanding of this complex conflict and a renewed commitment to making a difference in the world.